are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. My name is Kevin Bemmel and I'm your host. And I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and leadership practices, and then distill from those sources lessons we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So today is the fourth episode in a 24 episode series called the 24 episode campaign. I know, clever name, of course. And what I'm doing in this series is really taking a broad look at military theory, if you will, and then applying it to the business world. So I'm starting out with several episodes on strategy. This happens to be the fourth one. And then we're going to look at other areas of military doctrine after strategy. So today's episode is called The Danger of Total Victory. Now, this may sound very strange. Don't we want total victory? Back in World War II, for example, the Allies decided that the war would be over and they would win when there was unconditional surrender by the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And unconditional surrender certainly sounds like total victory, but there is a difference. And so I'm going to be talking about those issues today, and then drawing from them 5 lessons that we can use here in civilian life. So just a little bit of sort of background, if you will. I think that, from ancient empires to modern corporations, total victory sounds very attractive. We now have eclipsed all of our enemies, all of our competitors. We now control this particular geographic area in the case of an empire, or this particular product or service. The reality, though, is total victory oftentimes plants the seeds of decline for that empire or for that company. So eliminating all competition tends to also eliminate restraint on the part of the now, totally victorious company, as well as provoke a number of responses that I'll talk about later in the episode that all come together to basically try to defeat, if not destroy, what has become the, sole, or at least the overwhelmingly dominant market player. And so what we're really seeking to achieve is sustainable advantage. And that is indeed is what disciplined, far-sighted leadership looks to do. Okay, both on the military and the business side. So historically, looking at military doctrine now for a few minutes. So total victory referred to, first of all, war. Okay, now in ancient times, warfare did not at all look like the way war looked in World Wars I and II, or even how it looks today. Okay, I mean, a huge army could be a few hundred, mounted soldiers, for want of a better word for what they were, right? So, but nonetheless, if you had 600 soldiers and the enemy had 300, you could potentially just overwhelm the enemy. Okay, in the same way that if today someone has an army of 500,000 soldiers, they're likely to dominate an army of only 100,000 soldiers. Okay, but not necessarily the case, right? So consider the Ukraine-Russia war, where by all measures, Russia should have just plowed over the Ukrainian military, but it has not. Okay, all right. So total victory from a military standpoint, first of all, means a destruction of the enemy's military capacity. They can no longer wage war, number one. Number two, it meant political subjugation. Okay, so a king oftentimes would be killed or imprisoned, uh, typically not in the territory that was his former kingdom. He'd be taken back to the country of the victorious army, imprisoned there, where the rulers of that country could keep an eye on him. Okay, it meant territorial absorption, and in many cases, the loss of territorial and cultural identity for the defeated enemy, and it meant in total the elimination of a rival power. That's what total victory was all about. And so it certainly appears decisive. It appears to be permanent, but indeed, oftentimes it was neither. So, how many of the empires from 5,000 years ago still survive? I mean, China, kind of. Japan post-states China. The Mongolian Empire, not really, not as any kind of significant global power. Um, Roman Empire, gone. Greek Empire, gone. Babylonian Empire, gone. Persian Empire, gone. Egyptian Empire, gone, right? All of these empires that became so dominant, indeed, that dominance did not turn into long-term sustainability. So a couple of examples where total victory was attained, and yet it turned out to be Pyrrhic. So in the Punic Wars between Rome and its arch enemy Carthage, right? After decades of conflict in 146 before the Common Era, Rome um, basically defeated Carthage and razed the city. Okay, just turned it into nothing, essentially, eliminating Rome's greatest rival in the Mediterranean area. So the short-term outcome was that there was no immediate competitor to Rome. It gained territorial expansion, and it became the dominant naval and commercial power. However, the long-term effect of Rome's victory in the Punic Wars was a tremendous amount of internal corruption, a lot of political instability. There was a vast concentration of wealth in the hands of a small number of people that caused a lot of resentment among the citizenry. And I'm talking the actual citizenry, not the larger population, because most people in the Roman Empire were not citizens of Rome. That was something that was relegated or held really for a very select few. Okay, and this eventually turned into civil wars that ended up in the destruction of the Roman Empire, right? So by eliminating any kind of external conflict, external balance, essentially what Rome did is they accelerated internal imbalance. And in doing so, uh, this victory over Carthage revealed what was a great deal of internal structural fragility that led to the downfall of Rome. So again, total victory would seem like, oh, great, but in the end, it did not lead to a sustainable empire. Okay, a more recent example is the Allies' victory over Germany in World War I and the imposition, and I use that word precisely, the imposition of the Treaty of Versailles that imposed very harsh, very punitive measures on Germany. So in the short term, it seemed like, okay, the greatest or the strongest, not necessarily the greatest, but the strongest military power in continental Europe had been suppressed. Okay, and presumably this was going to mean no more wars in continental Europe. As well, France, for example, was able to expand its territory. Germany's colonies in the South Pacific were taken away from it. It lost its colonies in Africa, etc. So there were territory penalties. There were reparations, very harsh reparations put on Germany, with the intention on the part of primarily Britain and France to get back what World War I had cost them to fight. Okay, and this, interestingly enough, the United States urged leniency, or at least greater leniency in the Treaty of Versailles than what ended up going into the treaty. To a certain extent, the U.S. was, I don't want to say sidelined, but Britain and France were just not going to be reasonable in the surrender terms or in the in the treaty terms from Germany after the bleeding that they had taken for years in World War I. Unfortunately, what that meant for the longer term, and in this case, the longer term was only 20 years, and barely that, was Germany experienced economic collapse. It just could not operate an effective economy under the harsh reparation terms and other economic terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And this led to an opportunity for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to radicalize a large enough proportion of the German population that they were coming, that the Nazis were able to gain power in Germany, and in the event led to World War II, which was an even more devastating conflict than World War I. So in the end, again, the sort of total victory that the Allies claimed over Germany in World War I by way of the Treaty of Versailles turned out to be a Pyrrhic victory, because 20 years later, they found themselves fighting another war. And from Britain's standpoint, World War II essentially led to the breakup of their empire. So the Commonwealth remains, but shortly after World War II, India, for example, gained its independence, and the whole sort of structure of its empire ended up changing into what now today is called the Commonwealth. So because the victory of the Allies in World War I lacked strategic restraint, it created instability rather than a durable peace. Okay, so the sort of core military lessons are crushing an opponent can unify new adversaries, and that is indeed what we saw in World War II. So Italy, which in World War I was actually an ally of Britain and France and the United States, joined Nazi Germany as part of the Axis. Japan too was an ally of the United States, Great Britain, and France in World War I. Japan felt insulted under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, where it was not able to gain any territorial advantages. It was treated like a second-class country, and this caused a great deal of bitterness among the Japanese leadership, especially, which again led to an opportunity for a radicalization of politics in Japan, and Japan becoming a member of the Axis rather than rather than an ally of the U.S., Great Britain, and France, and other countries in World War II. So another factor is power vacuums. They just invite instability. So we see this so often, and we've seen it, for example, after the defeat of Saddam Hussein and his removal from power in Iraq. One of the mistakes in that war that President Bush made was the total victory over Iraq led to a power vacuum that caused an immense amount of problems because there was no governing authority to turn to that could make Iraq a solid ally of the United States and of the West. And that's just a small example, but it's one that's been repeated time and time again. It's one of the concerns right now with what's going on with Iran. So it's not at all clear that if the mullahs are defeated and removed from power, that there is any group that can come in behind the mullahs and take a hold of Iran. Now, the crown prince is still alive, and there's speculation that he would then go back to Iran. He appears to be pretty popular among just the regular people in Iran, and he would form a government where it would be essentially a constitutional monarchy, not unlike Great Britain. That is certainly an option, but it's by no means an assured situation that there won't be a power vacuum if the mullahs in Iran are removed from power. And so I think that's part of the hesitancy on the part of President Trump as he works to deal with the situation there. Another issue of total victory is the overextension or overexpansion or overextension. It tends to strain resources, right? So this was, I think, part of the thinking. So at the end of World War II, clearly the Soviet Union was highly suspicious of the other allies, primarily Great Britain and the United States. And clearly, even at that time, Stalin had been a bigger mass murderer than Adolf Hitler. And so Stalin was very concerned that that the U.S. and Great Britain would attack the Soviet Union. And indeed, General George Patton thought that would be the right thing to do because there were, the United States had huge armies. They were vetted in combat. They had been very successful. And it was his thinking that they should just plow on through and take on the Soviet Union then and there, rather than letting happen what happened, which in the event was the Cold War, right? But I think part of the problem with that is at that point, the Soviet Union had significantly increased its military production. It also had a strong, well-vetted army. Stalin had realized that his earlier purgings of senior military leadership had been a mistake. So he had to rebuild competent military leadership, which he had at the end of World War II. So it was by no means at all clear that had the United States continued eastward and taken on Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union, that they would not have been overextending their resources. far more likely that they would have been. And then again, and then also, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, so excess dominance or over dominance oftentimes provokes balancing coalitions, right? And we see that today. So the United States, as far and away the most dominant military power in the United States. So we see different coalitions. We see Iran, China, North Korea, and Russia essentially in a coalition looking to push back on American military power. We even see it among our allies, France, Germany, Great Britain, where they are skeptical of the United States, which has under President Trump been much more forthright in exercising its military power, right? And it's yet to be seen how this works out, but we shouldn't ignore the fact that having a dominant military power, having I'm not saying the United States has achieved total victory, but having a power that at least potentially could achieve the kind of total victory as that's historically been understood in military terms, that are, that other countries just stand by and don't respond to that. Quite to the contrary, they look to create coalitions with which they could potentially repel those, that dominant military power. Okay, so that's from a military standpoint. Let's take a quick break and we'll look at some business applications. When life brings unexpected changes, managing inherited property shouldn't add to your stress. Magnum Properties specializes in probate and trust real estate management. We handle the complexities while you focus on what matters most. From property maintenance to tenant relations, from legal compliance to maximizing value, we're your trusted partner through every step. Magnum Properties, Inc., turning property challenges into peace of mind. Call us today at 213-264-4396 or visit magnumprops.com. Okay, so what business lessons then can we learn from this idea that that there's danger in total victory? Okay, so like I said at the beginning, I have 5 thoughts on this. The first one is how, and we've seen this many times, how an aggressive plan of mergers and acquisitions can create or exacerbate internal fragility in the acquiring company. So large acquisitions increase complexity. That's for sure. They create cultural differences oftentimes. So, an example of this is when the Walt Disney Company acquired Pixar. So, as well as, by the way, when it acquired Industrial Light and Magic, which was George Lucas's company. So, both Pixar and Industrial Light and Magic had very different cultures, much more informal, much more flexible, much more kind of innovative, creative cultures than the Walt Disney Company did, which was as a much larger company than either one of them, had a much more corporate culture. And indeed, one of the concerns that people at Pixar and Industrial Light and Magic had in being acquired was that the parent company, the Walt Disney Company, would put constraints on them that would not allow them to do the kind of creative work that they had previously done that had made them so successful in such desirable acquisition targets. And there were definitely growing pains. And we're seeing now, while pretty quickly, Pixar, for example, went through a very what's a successful run of movies. More recently, Okay, as that acquisition has as it's been longer since the acquisition took place, it seems like, to use the vernacular, Pixar has lost some of its mojo. So we're not seeing the same kind of creativity and success that Pixar made with, for example, the shoot, the movies with Buzz Lightyear and the cowboy character. Oh my gosh, I can't think of the name of the movies. Anyway, but with those earlier movies, so the cultural clashes are real in business, and they can absolutely undermine the integration of an acquired company and its execution. So leadership bandwidth also becomes stretched. So as a company gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the most senior levels of leadership either have to devote more and more time, or they have to get further separated from parts of the company, so that other layers of leadership can be placed in between them, to effectively manage the company, right? So there's a dilution in leadership that goes on as a company grows. And finally, oftentimes debt burdens become so huge they restrict flexibility. So a company, so if we look at the merger kind of acquisition of AOL and Time Warner. So it seemed like it was going to be this ideal acquisition: new media, AOL; old media, Time Warner. But number one, the debt burden that was created by the merger of those two companies put a lot of economic constraints on the company. That was one problem. The second problem with that M&A was there was a culture clash. So how things were done, old media at Time Warner, were very different than how things were done at AOL, which was this, new media, more cutting edge kind of company. Okay. And as well, leadership really struggled to get a handle on this big, huge company and figure out how to actually get from it the kind of synergy and savings that they thought they would get. And in the end, it was not a successful M&A. It was bad for both companies. So oftentimes winning an acquisition results in a weaker overall institution. And so acquisitions need to be pursued highly strategically. Okay. Acquiring just because it sounds good or looks good, not necessarily the right thing to do. So if you think about the battle going on right now for time for I think it's still called Time Warner, if I'm not mistaken, where Paramount is one bidder and Netflix is the other, right? On the one hand, you've got Netflix, which is today's new media company. It's dominant in streaming. It has done some production, right? But it's not bound by owning, for example, an actual studio, a real estate based studio. So it can be very flexible where it produces its projects. So for it to buy Time Warner, okay, now it owns a big studio property. How does that help it in its strategic vision? It's understandable that they want the film library. They want more content. Okay, that certainly makes sense. But the cable channels, the legacy cable channels, and all of that stuff, it doesn't strike me personally as being a good fit for Netflix. On the other hand, looking at Paramount, so the Ellisons now control that company basically. So they've already got a bricks and mortar studio. What do they need with another one, right? It's kind of the same dilemma that the Walt Disney Company is in, having acquired 20th Century Fox. So they own two major studio facilities, I haven't read a whole lot about how that's going, but I know at least in the early days, it was not particularly an easy integration. Now, I will say that the difference for the Walt Disney Company and 20th Century Fox is they are very similar businesses: cable channels, studio facilities, content creators. Fox, on the other hand, was not particularly strong in streaming, whereas Disney was. And so that was something that from which the Fox assets uh, could benefit. So perhaps this is what the Ellisons and Paramount are thinking they'll do with Warner Brothers. Um, bulk up in terms of, again, additional content. Maybe Paramount will be able to take advantage of, I don't know, the legacy cable networks that Warner's has, CNN and the Discovery networks and such. I don't know. Cable seems to me to be a dying business. So I don't know. I understand that there needs to be consolidation in the media business. I'm not sure that either one of the acquirers, has a clear strategic vision as to how this will work. Okay, so that's number one. Aggressive M&A can create internal fragility. Number two, market dominance invites regulatory backlash. Um, there's th- there's no there's no disputing that this is the case. So dominant firms attract antitrust scrutiny and all kinds of government scrutiny. We see this among the large social media companies where Meta and um, uh, um, X and I'm trying to think of the other one. Shoot, it's not coming to mind. Anyway, um, they are constantly being, hauled before Congress to, talk about this issue or that issue. Any acquisitions they make are heavily scrutinized, and oftentimes from the get go. From the announcement of it, there are politicians out there saying this can't happen. They're too big, they're too dominant, right? So uh, these companies have, and by the way, the same is true with Amazon, um, and with other companies of the so-called Magnificent Seven. They are so huge, they are so dominant within their categories. Google, another Alphabet, which owns Google, another one of the Mag Seven. They're so dominant within their categories, within their industries, that no matter what they do, they face pushback politically, just because of their size and dominance. So and not just, by the way, by in the United States. The EU does the same thing. In fact, the EU, it seems to be even more forceful in its attacks on the Mag Seven. Uh, it's because I think in part they're not companies indigenous to Europe, and in fact, Europe has none of these companies going on. It really surrendered those markets to the United States. So the sort of drumbeat politically against these companies and other dominant market players oftentimes redounds into a shift of public perception. So whereas at one time most people seem to look on the social media companies as good, they were uh, mechanisms for easier communication, better dissemination of information, etc. Now, because they are so dominant, I think public perception of them has soured considerably. Now, by the way, there's also been a reevaluation of, is social media, for example, is it actually good, or is it more of a plague on our culture? That's another issue, but the reexamination happened, I think, in part because of the dominance of these companies. It's part of the pushback of them having achieved on some level total victory. So the greater the dominance of a company, the greater its visibility, and the higher the political risk. right? Okay, so market dominance invites regulatory backlash. Next, crushing competitors can eliminate the pressure to innovate. Okay, so the fact of the matter is, competition sharpens discipline. Okay, when I have to outcompete my competitors, I need to be thinking about how do I do that? If I don't have any competitors, I can sit, as they say, fat and happy and just, pull in the money. The problem is in a dynamic economy, and the United States is still a dynamic economy, probably the most dynamic economy in the world. No one is safe from competitors innovating. They may be very small and below the radar, okay, but they eventually emerge. One of the best examples is IBM. IBM, International Business Machines, became the dominant computer supplier back in the 1970s into the 80s. They were huge. They were it. Okay. They had at least ostensibly achieved total victory. Where are they today in terms of computers? Nowhere. Right. They were overtaken by Dell, Apple, Hewlett Packard, right? All these companies innovated with things like personal computers. Okay, that was really what did IBM in. And by the time IBM realized what was going on, okay, it was too late to the game. It never was able to create a competitive product in the sort of personal computer laptop market, right? And so it became more of a services company today, right? So while IBM essentially crushed all of its competitors, in doing so, it it also eliminated the need for it to continue to innovate in order to stay competitive. So uh, the removing of rivals, it basically reduces the sense of urgency that is what really undergirds innovation, right? We innovate because we have a problem. Rarely does innovation happen because everything is great, everyone's comfortable. No, innovation it comes from the same source as a pearl, right? So, how does an oyster create a pearl? It's because some sand gets into the oyster. The sand irritates the oyster, and so it secretes this compound around the sand that eventually becomes a pearl, right? So it is through the irritation that and that innovation happens, that solutions are found, right? And so when a company doesn't have to innovate, what replaces the innovative culture is a bureaucratic culture, right? Going back to the example of Disney acquiring Pixar and Industrial Light and Magic, again, that because Disney had become such, although not the dominant player, the Walt Disney Company certainly didn't achieve total victory, but they were a very dominant player in the entertainment business and had created a very bureaucratic culture. Now, the Disney Company was fond of talking about how welcoming they were to creatives and all this kind of stuff, but it was never as strong in the Walt Disney Company's culture as they claimed, and that was why ILM and Pixar, not the companies themselves, but people within them were very concerned about merging with Disney. Right? They didn't want to have to deal with the bureaucratic culture of Disney, which they did not have at ILM and Pixar, right? So, without competition, internal complacency becomes the enemy. And the fact of the matter is, internal complacency, by its very nature, is much more difficult to combat than an external competitor, right? And so, a company that falls prey to it uh, oftentimes doesn't even realize it until they've been completely outflanked. Okay, number four, Total market control encourages the formation of coalitions. So when a company becomes dominant, okay, what oftentimes results is very small companies who have little, if any, market power will band together in order to essentially be able to compete with the larger organization. Trying to think of a recent example of this. Hmm. I'll be honest, nothing comes to mind on this. We see this more often in the political sphere. Um, here, okay, here's an example. Okay. Um, so this is going back to the late 1980s, back when I had my real estate company. So prior to the passing of a law called FIREA, the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act, real estate appraisers did not have to be licensed. And so the dominant category of real estate appraisers had a designation called Member Appraisal Institute, and they were appraisers who had qualified for this designation, MAI. They were known as MAI appraisers. Okay. And then along comes FIREA, which required each state to license real estate appraisers, uh, state by state. So I was not an MAI at the time, didn't want to be an MAI at the time. But when the licensing regime came out, I got licensed right away as what was called, still is, I assume, a certified general real estate appraiser. It was the highest license that was available. And quickly, with my other non-MAI colleagues, got together and started promoting how we had the highest level of license available. Okay. And this was a more important credential than an MAI designation, which was not given by a government agency. It was given by a bunch of insiders in the business. The end result of that, and I'm not saying it was due solely to my small colleagues' efforts, but this became pretty much a national movement. I wasn't the only one who thought of doing this. Okay, I don't want to over-aggrandize what I did. I don't mean it that way at all. But it occurred to a lot of us that if we started marketing that we were certified general real estate appraisers, CGREAs, we could, in effect, if not completely destroy, at least severely downgrade what was largely a monopoly on appraising commercial real estate that was held by MAI designated appraisers. And in the event, that is what happened. So today, an MAI designation doesn't really mean anything like what it meant prior to 1989, right? So the dominance of MAI appraisers in the market led to the formation of a coalition by non-MAI appraisers that caused them to lose their dominance. Okay, and um, the dominance of doctors, medical doctors, MDs in the market, and how that worked out has led to the formation of a lot of sort of allied medical uh, um, levels, things like nurse practitioners, things like physician's assistants, and these sorts of things, right? So anytime in a business sense or a professional sense, some company or some group seeks to control the market, inevitably what you see is coalitions of the small form to challenge that dominance. So the same thing happens if one company is sort of the sole supplier of a particular product. Okay, it could be microchips, for example. Well, customers get nervous What happens if their sole supplier cuts them off? Now they're out of business. So they look for opportunities to diversify their supply chains. Okay. And then finally, new entrants, they're oftentimes, or at least sometimes, able to raise capital specifically to counter the dominance of the company that controls the market. Okay, so when so the market will respond to imbalance. It's not just going to sit back and go, "Oh, ho hum, this company controls this market. Okay, well, we're going to move on." Nope, that is not the case. Okay, in fact, I heard an interesting podcast yesterday. Uh, a woman has started. Not recently, but I think, I don't know, maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, not exactly sure how long ago, a new uh, pasta sauce brand of all things. And the hosts of the podcast were, why did you, this is a competitive category. Why would you want to get into it? And the reality is that the category is not nearly as competitive as it seems. There are essentially two dominant players in the sort of premium pasta sauce market. One is Carbone and the other is, it's like Rio or something like that. And in this entrepreneur's opinion, they were not particularly good. Now, I can't speak to them because I don't think either one of those are kosher, so I don't know if they're good or not. I'm just reporting what their competitor said on this podcast. And so she decided to do something that was much higher quality, okay, in order to challenge their dominance, okay? And that's oftentimes what you see. And she's now in the midst of looking to potentially raise enough capital to really take them head on, right? And she mentioned that there's one particular investor who knows her work, really likes what she's done. This isn't the only venture she's done. She's done many others. And he specifically wants to invest with her because he thinks she will be successful in challenging the entrenched players, right? So that's the kind of backlash that market dominance often generates. Okay, and finally, number 5. So restraint really creates longevity. So it's wise leadership that leaves space in the ecosystem, okay, that doesn't look to decimate all other competitors. So they avoid, smart leadership, they avoid predatory pricing that forces or at least, compels, I guess, is the same thing as forces, that compels a political response, that compels or that causes competitors to level, accusations of cheating and price fixing and that sort of thing. Okay. They choose sustainable margins over maximum extraction. Okay. So they don't price their products and services to squeeze every last dime out of their clients and customers, right? They look to create a mutually beneficial business climate so that they can continue to operate for the long term. And finally, they look to maintain partnerships rather than humiliating rivals. And I think this doesn't sound very popular today, but the reality is that while, of course, competitors cannot collude in a quasi-monopolistic way, on the other hand, there's nothing that necessarily prevents competitors from maintaining a robust competitive market while at the same time not looking to cut each other's throats. Okay, because the competitive market is mutually beneficial for the competitors. It keeps all of them on their toes, right? So if you look at the fast food market, okay, this is a very competitive market. Even McDonald's, which is the largest fast food company in the world, right? McDonald's has absolutely benefited from competitors, whether it's competitors who have different products like Chick-fil-A or uh, um, whatchamacallit, shoot, Rallies and the other more premium hamburger fast food brands, um, whether it's competition where they don't go head to head, like Taco Bell or Pizza Hut, right? So the fast food companies, they get better from competition. So as healthier fast food brands came out, McDonald's had to improve the healthiness of their offerings. As Domino's became dominant in the pizza market by delivering a credible pizza quickly. Pizza Hut and other pizza companies had to respond. Papa John's, whatever, right? Um, as Subway came out with fresher ingredients, right? Other companies had to respond. So rather than trying to destroy rivals, the fast food market has really benefited from the competition, right? So, uh, I'm missing my note here. Okay, yeah. So, um, good management. Um, I'm sorry. Um, so, healthy competition maintains companies' ability to to innovate, to retain market position rather than and longer than a conquest attitude. Okay, so in summary, what does restraint look like in business? Well, first of all, restraint does not mean weakness. It means scaling a pace of expansion that governance can support. That's number one. Number two, acquiring selectively rather than aggressively. Number three, pricing for durability rather than annihilation. And finally, preserving optionality. Okay. And so power needs to be managed, not maximized, right? And indeed, historically, that has been the strength of the United States' economic system, as opposed to, for example, the mainland Chinese system, where power is used to dominate. The government has chosen winners and losers. And as a result, China is not an innovative economic system. Okay. And that's why it's not as vibrant. Okay. People express concern about China as an economic rival, but in reality, China has a tremendous number of weaknesses these days because it doesn't have the kind of competitive climate that we have here in the United States. Okay. So, those are my thoughts on the danger of total victory. You might argue, well, are you calling for a kinder, business climate? Well, I'm not saying that competition shouldn't be sharp. It should be, but there's a difference between sharp competition and cutthroat competition. And yes, I don't advocate for cutthroat competition in business. I think that's a mistake. I think that we want to be wise competitors. We want to be strong competitors. We want to be uh, just competitors. Okay, and our entire economic system, and indeed our entire country, will benefit from that because through that kind of competition, the tide will be raised for everyone. So I thank you very much for joining me today. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, criticisms, links to show notes will be links to social media will be in the show notes when this episode posts on YouTube. I invite you to look at there. By the way, there are links in the show notes on Spotify and Apple Podcast as well. I tend to focus on YouTube because that's where my audience growth is focused right now. But all of the show notes are on Spotify and Apple Podcast as well, so you can find them there and post comments. Speaking of Apple Podcast and Spotify, If you know someone who you think would benefit from or enjoy these shows, I would really appreciate it if you'd refer them to the show. Maybe just share an episode with them. I know I do that with podcasts I listen to, and I'd love to have the opportunity to gain them as a subscriber. So I thank you very much for joining me. Tomorrow, by the way, 10 a.m. is my show, People Making Money. And then on every other Thursday, a reminder, every other Thursday at 5 p.m. is my show, Jiggers' Place, where we have a cocktail and a schmooze. So hopefully I will see you again later in the week. And that just leaves me to thank you again for joining me and sign off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times.